All right. 8 o'clock. Couple things. Morning. All right, so a couple things. Don't forget the quizzes, they're posted. All right, I will you have until I think the end of tonight to get the rest of the quizzes done, 8.1, 8.2, well, 8.2 and 8.3. So that's the life cycle and the lifespan quizzes. Those are on the exam, which you'll have on Friday. The exam will go live sometime about 5 in the morning. You'll have until about, I think, 11 or 11:30 to start it. So just make sure you get it done. I would have said you needed it completed by then, but I know some of you started 5 minutes before, and then if you got knocked out, you couldn't access it again. So hopefully we fix that. Also, IDEA evaluations, those are posted. I sent you the announcement about how we'll handle some extra credit points. That's on the actual course grid. So after we take the lecture and the lab grade and combine them, so 80-20 is the breakdown for that. Then we will add on the IDEA evaluations. If you take it, the emails will stop coming to you. Where do we sit right now? Here's my end of it. So I can show you that we have a 50% response rate right now, which is pretty good. But you know, I put this up just so you can see that I can't see any results. I don't know who's taken it. I just know that out of 60 enrolled students, 50% have completed it. So 30 out of 60. All right. So get it done. Encourage, and you'll see that I can't access the results until December 1st either. So it closes on Friday, next week Friday. That is the final exam day. So on those days, I think when you take the final exam, I don't think I'm going to set the ability to see your score until that Saturday, because typically that's how it's done. Is that the IDEA form closes just prior to the final exams. So that's where we stand with that. All right, moving ahead. Life history strategies, right? Collection of traits, all aimed at increasing fitness of the individual. Now, this is beyond just the adaptations to deal with the abiotic environments. This is all about reproduction. It's all about socializing, interacting, growth strategies, and so forth to try to maximize our fitnesses. All right, we talked about life cycles, simple versus complex life cycles, resting stages, and so forth. And then we talked about lifespan. We did that on Monday. You know, how long should we live? Now what we're doing is the reproductive patterns. So the investment of energy to reproduce. All right, so we start off with this question. Is reproductive output always maximized? If we talk about fitnesses, you know, maximizing fitness, one way that you probably think of is just have more offspring. If we have more offspring, then we should have a higher fitness. And selection should favor that, but it actually doesn't. It doesn't favor that, selection doesn't favor that, because there's a trade-off between our birth rates, so reproductive output, and survivorship. And that trade-off is a negative relationship. It's a negative correlation. So if we increase our birth rates, increase that BX column, then what we end up doing is reducing our survivorship columns. Likewise, if we increase our survivorship, if we want to live longer, then it's going to come at a cost of your birth rates. Now, whatever decision we make in terms of trying to optimize our fitness, it's going to affect that reproductive value curve, that VX curve. All right? So why is this? Why do we see this trade-off? Well, it's because of that limited energy. It's that finite energy that we have to allocate. If we're going to allocate it to reproduction, that means that energy, there's less energy available for other purposes, mainly growth and survival. All right? So, costs. What's the cost of reproduction? Well, several examples exist out there. All right, several examples exist. So, First example is just lost energy. If we're going to invest that energy in reproduction, it's no longer available for growth and maintenance. We talked about that. That's an allocation of energy and so forth. But the other thing to consider is that we also have an increase in mortality rates. If we're going to take part in reproduction, we tend to expose ourselves more to predators because we're out trying to find a mate. All right? In some cases, we're out trying to build a nest to attract mates and so forth. But if we enter into a competition with other individuals for that mate, then it also exposes us to injury. So there's these two sides of the coin. We're going to have lost energy, but we also increase our mortality rates, all because of this reproduction. All right? And the thing to consider is it's not just about how many offspring we produce, but it's also, do our offspring have a chance to reproduce itself? So it's our offspring success, reproductive success, that ultimately determines our fitness. As I say, you can take individuals, you can take two different species and hybridize them. In a lot of cases, you could get a hybrid. Well, maybe not a lot of cases, but in some cases, you get a hybrid individual, and you could say, hey, that's great, that's high fitness for each of those individuals, but it's actually not, because a lot of times our hybrids are sterile. They can't reproduce, which means that's basically zero fitness for our parents. All right? So if our fitness is going to be ultimately, or at least partially, determined by the success of our offspring, then we're going to have to balance our energy investment. We're going to have to balance it between how much we invest in our offspring and how much we invest in ourselves. So it's going to be a balancing act. It's going to be a trade-off to ensure not only our survival and our success, but also hopefully increase our offspring success. I do have a graph here that kind of shows that. So, in terms of, is reproductive output always maximized? What they've done is took nests and artificially increased the nests. And what you can see at our points is success of those enlarged nests actually reduces at fledgling. So yeah, you have more eggs early on, but when you monitor how many offspring actually survive getting out of the nest and going out on their own, it's actually much less. And that's bad for our birds. And we have several examples of birds where it's pretty easy to go out to the nest and add an extra egg or subtract an egg and see what happens with our nestlings. Do they survive? What proportion of them survive, and so forth. All right. So just a reminder, these figures, a lot of these figures are on the handouts that are posted. All right. So if this all comes down to a reproductive success of our offspring, how do we balance that energy? How do we balance those trade-offs? Well, this is the topic of our reproductive strategies. All right? And what forms our reproductive strategies is, surprise, a collection of trade-offs. Now, these aren't conscious decisions. These are evolutionary decisions. Selection has picked them. All right? They've picked them as having won out over other possibilities. And I'll note, since selection is acting and that we're measuring fitness, what's best in one environment might not be the best in another environment. So our strategies can differ between species. Some cases, our species are going to exhibit very similar strategies because they're in similar environmental conditions, similar selection pressures. And other times, they're going to be vastly different, and not just difference between our species, but even between populations of the same species. So just remember that. So what are these trade-offs? What are these reproductive strategies that we're going to talk about? We're going to talk about parental investment. So how do we allocate our energy to our offspring? That's going to include the topics of parental care. Should we take care of our young after they're born? And it's also going to deal with the size versus number of offspring determination. And as you're going to see, if we invest in a lot of energy to produce a large offspring, we can't produce many of them, and vice versa. Second idea is the number of reproductive events. Should we invest all of our energy to reproduce one time and have like one shot at it, or should we save some energy back and reproduce a second or third or fourth time later on in our life? The third thing that we're going to talk about is age at maturity. Should we invest our energy into growing and maturing early in life to try to get to that reproductive age earlier on? Or should we kind of hold back some of that energy? Maybe put it towards survival, maybe put it towards growth so that we reproduce later in life. What are the factors that favor these different types of strategies? And again, these are not mutually exclusive. We can't really talk about one without considering the implications of all of the other strategies that are out there. All right, and I say here, remember the principle of allocation. Go back to those first lectures. The first lectures in that first week or the second week of class. All right, if we have an adaptation, if we allocate energy for one purpose, it's unavailable for another purpose. I believe when we talked about the principle of allocation, we talked about it in terms of adaptations. So if we have an adaptation for one environmental condition, it can preclude or at least reduce our efforts to adapt to an opposite condition. The same things apply here. Just remember that principle. All right, so we're going to start with parental investment. Parental investment is defined as the total parental expenditure of energy on our offspring. All right, so it's our total parental expenditure of energy on our offspring. This is going to fall under parental care, size of offspring at birth, and number of offspring that we have every time we do reproduce. In terms of our parental care, we're talking about feeding our offspring, we're talking about defense of our offspring, and so forth. Now, whatever strategy we choose, or however we decide to allocate our energy in terms of this investment, is also going to incur costs with our offspring. All right, so if we invest in big offspring, all right, if we invest our energy into big offspring, what do you think that cost is for us? Well, if we produce big offspring, we can't produce a whole lot of them. What's the cost for the offspring itself? Well, in terms of being large size, hey, you've got a competitive advantage. You typically have more energy and so forth, but you don't typically share in perhaps parental care. Maybe we've invested that energy to make them big so that we don't have as much parental care after them. All right. If it's small offspring, it could be the reverse. We didn't invest a whole lot, so now we have a lot of parental care there, but the cost is they're going to be smaller, they're going to typically be less competitive, and so forth. We'll come back to our competitive and this aspects, big versus small offspring. All right. So with our parental investment, just remember that whatever we choose is going to affect not only us, but also our offspring. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about this big versus small offspring number. All right. We can't talk about size of offspring without talking about quantity of offspring because they're related. So this represents one of our first major trade-offs in reproductive strategies. If we produce large offspring, our offspring are going to be higher quality, and we give them an edge in terms of competition earlier in their life. And that's probably a good thing because that's typically the age, that period of their lifespan where they're most susceptible to mortality. All right, think back to our survivorship curves. We had that little drop early on for the type 1 survivorship curves. You're most susceptible at that early stages. So what we've done is invested our energy to try to give our offspring an edge. So just side by side, the bigger offspring should do better than our smaller offspring. All right, that's good for our offspring. But the cost for us is that we're going to produce fewer of them. We're going to produce fewer of the offspring, and that sets up this situation where if we happen to reproduce during a time that isn't so good, we run the risk of reproductive failure. Hold on, you could say, why is that reproductive failure? We just had our large offspring. Well, remember, fitness relies on our offspring being able to reproduce themselves. If they're born and then they die because of the environment, we've lost. That is reproductive failure for us. So if we invest our energy into having large offspring, but a small number of them, and then all of a sudden there's a disturbance that happens, or the environment turns bad, we run the risk of complete reproductive failure. Now, it's not going to be as likely because we've invested in a better quality, better competitor offspring, but it's entirely possible that we have complete reproductive failure, especially if the environment, if the conditions become harsh. It's like what?
It's like cheetahs that have their success, their chances of success for having an offspring make it to maturity is like less than, it's like 80% failure rate.
Yeah, 80%. Yeah, that's, and so cheetahs, if you say 80% failure rate, do they just have one?
They have 1 to 3.
They have 1 to 3. So
usually dies from malnutrition, one usually dies from predation, and one may make it.
One may make it. So what they're doing, they didn't invest in one big offspring. That's also, we can talk about physical limits, but we've now kind of moved to this making more individuals, making more offspring. All right? That kind of guards against that reproductive failure, because if the environment turns bad, if conditions worsen, what we're trying to do is we're hoping that at least one of our offspring survive. So the chance of complete reproductive failure is going to be much lower because we only need one to survive. Example that I say is, look at fish, look at frogs. How many eggs do they lay? In some cases, thousands, tens of thousands maybe. All right? How many of those offspring actually survive to reproductive maturity? Maybe a handful. All right? The chance of reproductive failure is pretty low for our parent because they produce so many offspring. Probability of death in those offspring is pretty high, it's really high. But the chance that all of them die is going to be pretty low. All right, so if you produce many offspring, you typically avoid complete reproductive failure because you only need one to survive, and you just increase your numbers, the chance that at least one of them survives starts to become pretty good. The downside of this is that our offspring are going to be small. They're going to be small, they're going to be lower quality, they're going to be poor competitors. Now you could say maybe these smaller, poor competitors is what makes them have a higher mortality rate, and you could say, yeah, that could be true. And then I say, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? All right, they kind of go hand in hand. We can't really talk about one and say, well, this causes the other one without recognizing that they're both related in some way. All right, so large versus size offspring is same as having few or many offspring. We can't talk about one without talking about the other. Parental care is the second part. So now what we're going to do is after our offspring are born, we're going to invest energy in their care. We're talking about providing nutrition to them. We're talking about providing defense to them. In some cases, we're talking about providing some immune responses. So, you talk about breastfeeding infants, the mother's milk, it has some antibodies, has some protective qualities for the infants. All right, that costs energy. Costs energy for the parent, but it tends to increase the survival of our offspring. And it increases it during their most susceptible time period of their life. That period where they have a high risk of mortality already. Now, the trade-offs of this kind of comes in with the number of offspring and the activity of the parents. So if we're going to provide care to the offspring, there's only so much care that we can provide. With each mouth to feed, that limited amount of energy and care that we can provide now has to be divided among each of those mouths. So maybe we can say, I'll put it this way. If you have kids, maybe you're hoping to have kids. Let's say you go to, I hate to use McDonald's. Chuck E. Cheese isn't around here. We used to have what was that other one? Gaddy's, Mr. Gaddy's? Yeah. Maybe we'll use Mr. Gaddy's Chuck E. Cheese. All right. So you go there, do your pizza thing. Hopefully you guys all know what those are, right? And they got the games in there. So let's say you go there and you say, I've got $20 for the kids to play their games. I don't know, does that go a long way? It used to be like quarters when I played. And then I felt ripped off when everything went to 50 cents. But anyways, you got $20 for the kids. You got one kid, that one kid gets all $20. All right? You have two kids, you got to split it between both of them. Each of them gets $10. You get three of them, now you're dealing with fights because who gets that odd quarter? All right? Who gets the odd one? Same thing applies out in nature. Our parent can only provide so much energy to their offspring, can only provide so much care. So if you have one offspring, yeah, we're going to probably increase the survival rate, greatly increase the survival rate of that one offspring. But with each successive offspring, each of them is going to receive less and less of that care until we get to the point where our parents not providing enough energy to drastically increase the survival of our offspring. And that represents an upper limit. All right? Some of that's why our birds, the parents provide care for the nestlings. That's why some of our birds only produce a set number of eggs or a maximum number of eggs. A lot of times they just can't care for them. They can't provide the nutrition for them. The other thing to consider is the loss activity for our parents. If we're going to care for our young, that means that's less energy available to us. And that's in terms of energy for other activities. So it could be mating again. All right? If we're a species that can mate and then, after we have our offspring, we can start mating again, immediately, we don't have to wait for that next year to come around. Well, if you have kids and you're going to take care of them, that's lost energy. We can't go out and find another mate and reproduce again. We have to care for our young until they leave the nest, and then we can start mating again. So that represents a cost. That's fewer offspring that we have. But we're caring for it to try to maximize the survival rate of that one offspring. Foraging. We're foraging for our young instead of really foraging for ourselves. So some of these organisms, they have their offspring. You see their body condition, their weight gradually decline because they're investing more energy. They're taking that energy that they've invested and putting it towards their offspring and over themselves. Once the birds leave the nest, once the offspring leave the nest, then their body condition starts to improve again. And we've got other examples as well. So, you can think about how lost activity for our parents could be a cost to us. And these are all trade-offs. Trade-offs when we invest in our offspring. Questions on that? Number of reproductive events. That's the second part of our reproductive patterns. How many times should we reproduce over the course of our life? Should we reproduce once? Should we reproduce many times? Should we do it like an in-between type of number? Well, what we're going to do here is kind of split it up between one time and multiple times and talk about benefits and costs to each. So we'll start with the first one, simulparity. This is also called simulparous reproduction. All right. This is a reproductive strategy in which the female reproduces once in her lifetime. Once, that's it. All right. It's also called Big Bang reproduction because this type of strategy tends to be correlated with producing many offspring all at once. All right. So what you're doing is if you're going to reproduce one time in life, you're going to do everything you can to ensure that you have as many offspring as you can to try and hope that as many survive. When does this type of reproductive strategy appear? Well, it's typically exhibited in species where the cost of reproduction is high. All right, so if we're going to reproduce, and just by the act of reproducing, we're increasing our mortality rates, and drastically increasing our mortality rates, then it probably makes more sense to invest all of our energy then into that one reproductive period because it's unlikely that we would survive to a second reproductive attempt. All right, salmon migration. Salmon, Pacific salmon, great example. All right, they exhibit simulparity. That migration to get into the river get upstream in the river is extremely hard on them. They're going to get up there, they're going to reproduce, and then they're going to die. All right? There's no hope for them to migrate back out to the ocean. So they're going to invest their energy, as much energy as they possibly can, into that one reproductive event. Second situation when this is characterized is when we have low survival of the adults between each of our reproductive events. So we can kind of set this up to say we're dealing with a species that reproduces once per year. All right? If the chance of surviving to the next year is, let's say, 10%, that's a pretty high mortality rate. 90% of the time, you don't make it to that next year. So because that risk is high, because your chance of survival to that next period is really, really low, we're going to probably invest our energy into that one reproductive event. As soon as we can reproduce, we're going to reproduce, and we're going to do it all at once and try to maximize our output at that point. The third case where we typically see this is when juvenile or larval mortality rates are high. So think fish, think amphibians. They produce thousands of eggs, thousands of offspring. Why is that? It's because mortality rate is pretty high in those offspring. All right? We're going to try to maximize how many offspring we have with the hope that at least some of them survive. Because that mortality rate is high, we're investing a lot of energy into number of offspring, which makes it less likely that we're going to have any energy available for later on in life. Now, we're going to see when we merge two strategies, but know that this is when larval and juvenile mortality rate is high, we tend to exhibit similarity. All right? This pattern, having a large number of offspring, is also correlated with minimal parental investment for each. All right? We don't care for our offspring as much. We produce tons of them. We're just going to let them go on their own and hope that at least some of them survive. Now the problem, and we've already kind of started to allude to it, is one of risk of reproductive failure. We've invested our energy into a single reproductive event. If we happen to reproduce during a bad year, chances are pretty high that all of our offspring are going to die. If they all die, we've just had complete and utter reproductive failure during the one reproductive attempt that we have in our life. That's not a good thing. It's not a good thing for our individuals. So there's risk to that.
Will the spiders that the eggs eat the parent after they hatch, does that count as this, or is that something different?
Where the offspring consume the parent, I would put that under this. Parental care. So the parent basically sacrificed himself to increase the chances that their offspring will survive. Provides them with the food source themselves. But yeah, this is also similarity. They reproduce once, that's it. So they're going to do what they can to try to maximize the chance that at least some of their offspring will survive. All right, so the opposite of similarity is heteroparity, or heteroparous reproduction. This is a reproductive strategy in which the females reproduce more than once in their lifetime. All right, so if we're going to reproduce more than once, we don't necessarily have to invest all the energy that we have into reproducing when we do reproduce. So we exhibit this type of pattern when reproduction really isn't costly in terms of increased mortality risk. Think humans. The act of reproducing does not really increase our mortality risk very much. All right? And this is going to apply to both the parents and the offspring. So having an offspring, having children, doesn't necessarily increase our mortality risk for us or the offspring. All right? It's pretty standard. Also, when survival between our reproductive events is likely, it gives us a reason to say, hey, let's not invest all of our energy at this one event because we can survive to reproduce again. So if there's a chance that we can survive, if there's a good chance that we can survive to reproduce again, that could be a benefit. Now, when we exhibit iteroparity, what we often see happen is the parents invest their energy in some other aspects of their offspring. All right. What other aspects do we see? Well, we often see increased offspring size. We tend to invest the energy in producing quality offspring at the cost of a decreased clutch size. And also, we tend to see an increase in parental care. We have our offspring, we're going to invest into their success, because if they survive to reproductive age and they reproduce, that helped our fitness. The other side of the coin with this is that our risk of total reproductive failure is going to be much less likely than with semiparity. Yeah, a year could go bad when we reproduce. Times could become very tough and difficult and harsh. And we could lose our offspring. But we can reproduce again. We could reproduce next year or the year after that. And at that time, hopefully conditions have improved. All right. Now, again, talk about like making a conscious decision. It's really not a conscious decision. It's more of an evolutionary decision. Sometimes it's a behavioral decision as to when we're going to reproduce. When do we hold off? When do we try to attempt to reproduce? All right. But with the iteroparity, there's going to be a much higher likelihood that at least you have good conditions during one of your reproductive events, and that ensures that our offspring survive. All right. Downside of this is that our offspring, typically, we only have one or a few offspring that ultimately survive to reproduce. But that's okay, because that's really all that we need. It's really all that we need to ensure that our genes get passed down to that next generation. All right? We good? Let's do this. All right. So, third aspect, age at reproductive maturity. When should reproduction begin? Now, this is going to be a balance between survival and reproductive output. All right, that's going to be our decision. Because if we mature early, what we've done is invested our energy in reproduction instead of growth. So again, we've got this finite energy supply. Growth, reproduction, and maintenance. Those are those three main categories where we invest the energy. And what we've decided is we're going to invest energy into growth up until we reproduce, and then everything goes towards reproduction. So we try to get to reproductive age, to reproductive maturity as early in life as possible. Now that could be a good thing because it increases the chances that we can actually survive to reproduce. All right? But there's a problem with that. Because since we've invested in reproduction and maturation, we tend to be at a smaller size. So if our reproductive output, if our reproductive success is correlated to size, correlated to age, correlated to status, maturing early doesn't help us. We actually have fewer offspring, probably fewer successful offspring. All right. In terms of survival to reproduction, yeah, that applies across the board. But if we're dealing with an iteroparous species, maturing early is also beneficial because it increases the number of times that we could possibly reproduce. So let's say our lifespan is 10 years. If we mature at age 6, all right, we can reproduce at age 6, age 7, age 8, age 9, and maybe age 10, so 5 time periods. But if we reproduce at age 3, we've just added several more years, several more reproductive events to our life. And that's a benefit. So that's early maturation. Invest our energy to mature early. Flip side is don't do that and delay maturation, delay reproduction until later in life. When does that get favored? Typically it gets favored when our fecundity, when our reproductive output is related to parental size, or when our mating success is size or age dependent. Could be status dependent as well. So if our reproductive success, overall reproductive success, is dependent on us being larger, older, maybe wiser, it benefits us to delay reproduction. Use that energy towards survival. Use that energy towards growth. Get bigger so that when we do start reproducing, we're going to be more successful. All right? If we deal with species that hold territories, the bigger, the best species tend to hold territories. So, instead of trying to reproduce early on when we're small, when we're young, invest that energy into growth instead. Delay your reproduction until you're now at that large, big status. Questions? All right, so these aren't independent of each other. They are all related, and they all come back to this idea here, this R versus K selection strategies. These are two different strategies. They actually represent two ends of a continuum that inform us about the reproductive patterns, reproductive strategies of a species. Now, they got its name, this R versus K selection strategies, based on our population's position on the growth curve up here. All right, so our selection strategies tend to be favored when our populations, when our species exist at our low numbers, where we are far from our carrying capacity. At this area, it's unlikely that we're in competition. Yeah, there is some competition, but it's unlikely that we're feeling intense intraspecific competition. We think down in this area that we are entirely have unlimited resources. So the strategies here are going to try to maximize our reproductive effort, reproductive output. The other one are the K selection strategies. Now we're dealing with populations that tend to exist near their carrying capacity, where there's a lot of intraspecific competition. We're competing with other individuals of our own species. And now these strategies are going to favor individuals who are better competitors, whose offspring are better competitors, and so forth. We go for quality as opposed to quantity. All right? So let's talk about these R selection strategies. Our focus with this strategy is on our current reproduction, on this B sub X. What are we doing today? Usually our populations exist at low density, meaning it's far away from our carrying capacity. And these strategies tend to emphasize the quantity of offspring that we produce. What we're trying to do here is maximize R. We're trying to maximize our intrinsic rate of growth because that's where we're at. We're down at this area. We want to exhibit this exponential growth at that point. So what are the traits associated with this strategy? Similarity. Increase the number of offspring that you have, but only have them all at once. Early age at maturation. Get to reproductive age and reproduce at that point. Large clutches. This. Having a large clutch correlated to, small-sized offspring. All right? Rapid growth. Grow quickly to get to that reproductive age so that you can reproduce. And lastly, you're going to provide minimal, if any, parental care. You can't, you have too many offspring. You can't care for them all. All of these things are aimed at maximizing our intrinsic rate of growth, R. And go back, you can look at the equation. It's birth rates minus death rates plus immigration minus emigration. If we assume that migration is 0, we're trying to maximize our BX. We're trying to maximize our output. Now, species that exhibit our selection strategies typically have a type 3 survivorship curve. Type 3 survivorship curve, remember, we've got log of L sub X, right? Type 3 curve looks like that. Did the type 3 curve produce this these types of traits, or did the types of traits produce the curve? Again, they kind of go hand in hand. They're just correlated. All right, so type 3 survivorship curves, or species with type 3 survivorship curves, tend to exhibit this, and it kind of makes sense. If you have high mortality rates early on in life, it benefits you to produce as many offspring as you can with the hope that at least some survive. The cost of that, they're not going to be high quality. All right? You're not going to be able to take care of all of them, and you're probably only going to reproduce once. All right? Also, species that are in low competition habitats. So these are habitats where you don't see a whole lot of intraspecific competition. You're looking at increasing your reproductive output. In many cases, these low competition habitats are habitats that have frequent and harsh disturbances. So these are disturbances that are reducing our population sizes and prevent our population sizes from ever approaching our carrying capacity. Regularly disturbed habitats. So our selection strategies, type 3 survivorship curves. K selection strategies are going to focus on our future reproduction. And it's focusing on future reproduction because of our survivorship. All right, we're going to have a high survivorship between our reproductive events. Now, with this future reproduction, we're typically near our carrying capacity. So because of that, we're going to try to emphasize producing quality offspring instead of producing a whole lot of offspring. Now, our traits, the life history traits that are associated with this strategy, are all about maximizing the competitive ability of our offspring. We're trying to give them as much of a competitive edge as we possibly can so that they can survive. This would include iteroparity. Right? We can reproduce multiple times. We have a high chance of surviving to that next reproductive maturity, or to that next reproductive period. Delayed maturation. Grow bigger, become more successful, and then reproduce. Small clutches, because we're going to have large offspring. We're going to exhibit slow growth. We're going to invest in survival, make sure that we can survive and we can grow to get to that reproductive age. And since we're producing large offspring and we're not producing many of them, we're going to invest in usually substantial parental care. Species that are characteristic of this type of strategy typically exhibit a type 1 survivorship curve. You do have higher risk mortality earlier in life. We're investing our parental care into this stage to try to maximize our survival. Species that are in highly competitive habitats tend to exhibit this case selection strategy. They're trying to give their offspring an edge. And in many cases, these are going to be in habitats that experience infrequent and less harsh disturbances. In many ways, you can consider these stable habitats, stable environments. These things probably aren't changing very much, so once our population sizes grow up and get to their carrying capacity, they're probably not going to change very much. Yeah, they're going to fluctuate with some natural environmental variation, but we're going to be cycling or going to be fluctuating around that carrying capacity. Now, these two strategies represent opposite ends of a continuum. Our selection strategies are at one extreme, K selection strategies are at another extreme. But we see mixtures of this strategy. We don't always see every single trait of a K selection strategy. We don't always see every single characteristic of this R selection strategy. So what we often see is something in the middle, and this follows what's called bet hedging theory. We're going to hedge our bets by taking a mixture of these two different strategies. So what is this bet hedging theory? Well, it's defined as the idea that organisms that experience unpredictable environments should reduce their variation in fitness by spreading out the risk of reproductive failure. So instead of putting all of our eggs in one basket, what we're going to do is split them up between, let's say, 2 or 3 different baskets. So if we lose one, or if we lose 2, we still have a basket to fall back on. All right? Now, what you should know is that life history traits have evolved to avoid this complete reproductive failure. And as a result, we tend to see mixtures of these strategies. All right? And this bet hedging theory is based on the idea that unpredictable events in the environments could result in zero reproductive success for our organisms. And selection, evolution wants to avoid that. So they've taken this mixture strategies to say, hey, we're going to sacrifice some of our reproductive effort, reproductive success today to avoid a complete reproductive loss in our entire life. So we're going to give up some today so that we can reproduce or do a little bit of something with our reproduction later on in life in the hopes that we avoid complete reproductive loss. All right? So here's the idea, a graph. We've got unpredictability, so variation in favorable conditions. All right? If we have, let's see here, and mean reproductive success. All right? So if our variation in favorable conditions is high, what we're going to do is we favor not necessarily a pure itero-pair strategy, but more of a bet hedging strategy. We're going to have characteristics, qualities of this Big Bang reproduction, qualities of semal parity, but we're going to reproduce several times over our life. You know, think some fish, think some amphibians. Yeah, they tend to exhibit this Big Bang reproduction, but they do it several years. It's because of the unpredictability. If the environment was pretty constant and stable, then we're going to be much better to exhibit one of these pure strategies, this semal parity Big Bang reproduction type response, because we reproduce today, it's going to be no different than if we reproduce tomorrow because conditions are basically going to be the same. Example. We've got two different strategies to choose from. In one strategy, we reproduce once and have 10 offspring. All right? If all offspring die, we lose. That's complete reproductive failure. But if times are good when we reproduce, that's great because we just have 10 offspring survive. And we had 10 offspring to contribute to our fitness. Strategy 2 sacrifices some of that. Now what we're going to do is we're going to say instead of reproducing once, we're going to reproduce twice. The cost of that is that we're only going to have 5 offspring at a time. All right? So now it's less likely that we're going to lose all 10 offspring because conditions have to be bad both years that we reproduce. The downside, though, is in a good year, we don't have 10 offspring, we only have 5. The 5 reproduce. So we do okay, not as good as strategy 1, but we've kind of hedged our bets against complete reproductive loss. Desert annuals, great example of this. Our plants, these plants have long-lived seeds, all right? But only a portion of those seeds ever germinate in any one year. What proportion germinates? Well, it depends on the uncertainty in our environment. All right? If the environment is constant, if every year is going to be a good year, you're going to have a very high proportion of seeds germinate. Selection is going to favor that. But if we have high level of uncertainty of whether or not we get rain and so forth, or if we get enough rain in the environment, then we're going to start reducing the percentage of seeds that germinate in any one year. Some cases, less than 10% of the seeds germinate each year. So you've got 100 seeds in 1 year. You only expect 10 seeds to germinate. And then in the next year, you've got 90 left, so 10% of that is 9 seeds the next year and so forth. So what the plant has done is hedged its bets by only having a certain percentage of their seeds germinate in any 1 year. If the year's bad, hey, we've only lost a small percentage of offspring. But if the year's good, we've got some offspring that can survive. All right? So here's our summary for this. Reproductive output's not necessarily the physiological maximum, right? We're not going to be favored for that. All right? You have to remember that energy is going to be devoted for several activities, and there's costs and benefits to all of this. All right? And how we allocate our energy could be good, could be bad. We have to consider both. All right? The main players for these is our output, BX, and our survivorship, LX. All right? And they're related. If we invest in one, we're not investing in the other. All right, and we have to consider that with our strategies. And then, we talked about the R versus K selection, all right, and bet hedging strategies, and which is chosen is going to be specific to specific environments. So even between the two populations of the same species, one population could be more R-like strategy, one population could be more K-like strategies. All right, it's dependent on fitness. We've got those 3 properties of fitness. Got to remember those. All right. This quiz will go live probably sometime tomorrow. All right. It's not going to be due until the end of the day on Monday. All right. And we're going to have one more presentation. We're going to talk about competition and the idea of a niche to kind of hopefully wrap things up for this class on Monday. All right. Don't forget the quizzes this week. Make sure you are studying for that exam. All right. Guys, have a good one.